Of when their siblings go missing. 3 real-life mysteries, 3 sisters determined to find out the truth. We start with a story that begins in 1968. With America embroiled in the Vietnam War, a young sailor mysteriously vanishes from his ship. But his sister never accepts the Navy's explanation of his disappearance. For years, she searches for what really happened. As John Miller first reported in 2001, it's a tale where a bit of luck and a lot of persistence changes everything.
It was what they call a cold case, decades old and still an unsolved mystery. It's the story of a missing sailor, stolen money, and a sister who refused to believe her brother was a deserter and a thief.
We almost never talked about him because it always came down to the unauthorized absence, deserter status, suspected of theft.
But to his family, it didn't make sense. Andy Munns was a good kid. In Montclair, New Jersey, class of '61 at Montclair High. He loved backyard basketball and doing science experiments in his basement. He was very popular.
We had 5 children in the family. Andy was the middle child, and he was the happy one. He was the one who everyone got along with.
But after he vanished, it would take more than 30 years for Mary Lou Taylor to answer the question that hung like a shadow over her family and her brother's memory. What really happened to Ensign Andy Munns? To understand her journey, you must go back to 1968. The Vietnam War was raging. Across the South China Sea, Subic Bay served as a forward staging area for naval operations. Andy Munns was a brand new ensign on board the USS Cacapon, a Navy fueling ship. Mary Lou remembers a postcard home.
It was happy, cheerful. Life's a great adventure. The crew was good. The ship was great.
But on January 17, 1968, just 3 weeks after the ensign from New Jersey arrived, Andy Munns went missing. And not only had Andy, the ship's new paymaster, disappeared, so had $8,600 from the ship's safe. To investigators, the first theory was the most obvious. $8,000 could take a young sailor far away from an unpopular war, or not far at all, just outside the gates of the Navy base, Olongapo. It was a rough, steamy port town where booze and sex and crime blended with the background music. Sailors disappeared here regularly, either going AWOL, deserting, or becoming victims of foul play. As the years passed, Andy's parents deluged the Navy with letters and queries, but Andy's status didn't change. Deserter. And that took a toll.
It broke my father's heart. I mean, he literally had a heart attack 3 years later. And I'm not blaming the Navy for his heart attack. But the fact is, it was harder, I think, than just losing a son.
In the mid-'70s, after years of holding out hope that he might somehow return, Andy's family decided to have him declared legally dead. They wanted to have a memorial service, but when they asked if the Navy would supply an American flag to present to his family...
Oh, no, they would never do that. That's for honorable discharges.
Had the Navy come to the determination that Andy Munns was the victim of a murder on board the Cacapon, he would have been listed as killed in the line of duty during the Vietnam War, and he could have been memorialized here with honors at Arlington National Cemetery. But a generation after the war, the Munns family still was without answers, without a body, and in the eyes of the Navy, Andy Munns was still without honor. Mary Lou was determined to change that, but she would have to become more than just a loving sister. She would have to become a detective. And like any good investigator, she would need to catch a break. What was the first thing you did?
I found a Vietnam veterans user group or bulletin board or something. And as I recall, it was something like, my brother was on the USS Cacapon. I have some names, but I need to know how to get in touch with these people. I need to find out what happened to him.
I had literally been on that forum for about 20 seconds.
In an astonishing stroke of luck, across the country in San Francisco, Tim Rosaire, a former Cacapon crewman, had just logged onto the bulletin board for the first time.
I instantly knew what it was. And I wrote her back saying yes, and I may have been one of the last people to see him.
Rosaire was ship's journalist. He published a newsletter, a kind of yearbook or the cruise book. Rosaire was actually using Andy's cabin during the day as his office and got to know the young ensign.
was sort of looking forward to, you know, being in the Navy, and was very proud of being an officer.
And there was something else.
I knew him well enough to know that he wouldn't have stolen the money.
Rosaire supplied Mary Lou with names and some photographs of the crew. She tracked down the captain, only to learn he had just died. But his wife remembered that Andy's disappearance had always haunted her husband.
She said, I know my husband never got over that because he knew, I think that someone must have taken money from the safe and done something with your brother.
Mary Lou had combed through the Navy's original reports of the investigation, and there were things that didn't add up.
There were people on the ship who were deliberately lying to create a motive for why Andy would have left.
Mary Lou learned that while $8,600 was missing, another $51,000 was still in the safe. If Andy had run off with the money, why not all of it? The Munns family wanted the case reopened.
Essentially, every time we contacted the Navy, they said, if you have new evidence, you can...
Substantial new evidence.
Substantial evidence, then we'll reconsider.
When we come back, Mary Lou catches a break and gets help from an unexpected source.
We saw some things that didn't make a whole lot of sense.
And finally learns the truth about her brother.
He started motioning with his hands, and one of the other investigators came into the room and said he's confessing.
Stay with us. Mary Lou Taylor's brother Andy had disappeared during the Vietnam War, branded by the Navy as a deserter and a thief. But even after 30 years, she was determined to clear his name and uncover the truth. She had already found veterans online who remembered him, and they also thought he was innocent. But to reopen the case, the Navy wanted new evidence. Once again, John Miller.
In the mid-1990s, Mary Lou set out to find that evidence, to trace Andy's old shipmates from 1968. She began her long journey back into time in search of the truth.
We looked in the bars, some of the houses of ill repute, tapped into informants that we had. We also, of course, checked on the base.
She found Special Agent Ray McGady, the original investigator assigned to find Andy. He was retired and living in North Carolina. Her call reopened old wounds.
I said, this is Mary Lou Taylor. I understand you investigated the disappearance of my brother in the Philippines in 1968. And he said,
yes, I remember it very well. Probably better than any other case I've ever worked.
You know, I see when you talk about that, you get emotional and choked up. Do you feel that the Navy let this kid down?
I think that the Navy did everything it could at the time to try and resolve the issue. Of course, I feel a personal sense of responsibility because I was the case agent. There were all kinds of guys who worked on this case with me. But clearly I was the guy.
But in 1997, McGady would, in a small way, return to the case that had haunted him for so long. He helped Mary Lou get Andy's file put in front of Pete Hughes, head of the newly created Cold Case Squad at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Mary Lou had turned up a number of new questions, to which Hughes wanted answers.
We saw some things that didn't make a whole lot of sense and caused us to want to reactivate the case.
Hughes assembled a team of homicide investigators, including a criminal profiler. They studied the statements from 1968 and began re-interviewing crew members 30 years later. For the first time, the focus now shifted from theft to a homicide.
What we want to do is know everything there is to know about the suspect in the case.
Suspicion would focus on several former crew members. One was Michael LeBrun, who was living outside Kansas City, selling real estate. But in 1968, he worked in the dispersing office with Andy Munns, had access to the safe, and was one of the first to suggest that Munns may have deserted.
He characterized him as immature. Basically, he came up with an idea that perhaps Ensign Munns had gone over the hill.
But Pete Hughes knew, without a body or any physical evidence, the only way to make a case was to get LeBrun to admit to the murder. It was tricky work. How do you get a confession on a 30-year-old murder?
We talk about it being a terrible mistake, an accident, you haven't been able to talk about this, and this is your chance. We live in a forgiving society, and a lot of people are going to want to forgive you, but they're not going to forgive you unless you step up to the plate and tell the truth.
After 4 interviews with LeBrun, Hughes devised a new strategy. Mary Lou Taylor would attend the next interview with LeBrun. Why did they feel it was important that you be there?
They were hoping that that might make it more likely that he would confess.
But would it work? At first, Mary Lou watched through the one-way glass as the agents interviewed LeBrun in a room covered with more than a dozen enlarged photographs of the Cacapon, his shipmates, and Ensign Munns. Then something started to happen. LeBrun described in detail how he strangled Andy.
It was like watching an old movie with an old silent film, but you could tell that something important was happening. There was a time when his body language changed. He started motioning with his hands, and one of the other investigators came into the room and said he's confessing.
Then Mary Lou was brought into the room. Did you say, why did you do this?
He talked a little bit about his, about being caught in a robbery.
Stealing the money.
Yeah. He said he just couldn't find a way out. He panicked and he decided to kill him.
Investigators say to cover up the murder, LeBrun explained how he dumped the body in one of the ship's huge oil tanks. Andy's body was never found.
He, at first, looked as if he were crying, but when he looked at me, there were no tears in his eyes.
As she got up to leave, LeBrun made a request. Mary Lou couldn't believe what she was hearing.
And he said, "May I give you a hug? Would that be okay?" And it was like the dumbest question I had ever heard. I said, no, I don't think so. No, I'm sorry, you can't hug me.
Do you have anything to say to Mary Lou Taylor or the Munn's family? I have no comment.
LeBrun was charged with murder. He pled not guilty. Andy said in a statement to 2020 that intense psychological pressure and deceit from investigators forced him into admitting to a crime he did not commit. In part, a federal judge has agreed, ruling that prosecutors cannot use the videotaped confession because LeBrun's constitutional rights were violated. The judge found that LeBrun had been advised of his rights months earlier at several meetings, but not at the last interview, the day he allegedly confessed. The judge wrote, "It appears agents gradually overwhelmed LeBrun's will, lying about evidence against him and promising him he would not be prosecuted if he confessed." Without a legal and reliable confession, the government doesn't have much of a case. They are filing an appeal of the confession ruling, but Mary Lou says she got what she was really looking for. She finally learned what happened to her brother. And as for the man charged with killing him,
I still don't care whether this man goes to jail. I really don't.
unless I'm reading this wrong, it sounds like in some way you feel sorry for him.
In some way, I feel like he's been paying for this all his life, whether he knows it or not.
"33 years after Ensign Munns disappeared from the USS Cacapon, a ceremonial casket covered with an American flag made its way to a gravesite in Arlington National Cemetery. Friends and family came from around the country, and so did naval criminal investigators, to watch as Andy Munns was given full honors in recognition of his service to the Navy and his country. Andy Munns is no longer a deserter, and the Navy finally gave Mary Lou that flag.
Just on behalf of the grateful nation and proud Navy, this national ensign is presented in memory of your brother's honorable service to our country.
This is what I would like my parents to have had 33 years ago. I'm very proud of my brother. He was a very honorable person.
After years of fighting in the courts, Michael LeBrun's confession was ruled admissible. He ultimately pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter in the death of Andy Munns. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison and released in 2009. When we come back, another woman looking for her sister unlocks a mystery from the past.
My sister was married to John David Smith.
And she's missing, isn't she?
And he said, my God, lady, you have a problem.
Stay with us. Just a year after getting married, a woman mysteriously disappears. Her sister is determined to find out what happened, and that mission, as John Miller first reported in 2001, leads to a mysterious box that holds the key to murder.
On the road that the box was found on, there may not be a car down there for a number of hours.
There was no telling how long the box had been lying there. It was discovered in April of 1980 by a work crew cleaning a drainage ditch on an Indiana farm road. The box held a dismembered corpse. And what Deputy Sheriff Jerry Berman saw that day would haunt him for 20 years.
It wasn't something you dwelled on, but it was just something that you never forgot it.
And had you ever seen anything like that before?
Not in my career or in my life until that time, no.
Outside of determining that the body was that of a woman, the sheriff's office was never able to identify her. The county buried her in a pauper's grave in this cemetery in Morocco, Indiana. What was dubbed the Lady in the Box case was to become part of a much larger mystery. But Deputy Jerry Berman would never know that until he got a letter 2 decades later.
Well, I wasn't aware that I held the key.
But he did hold the key to a mystery that began 26 years before in another small town, Seville, Ohio. That's where Janice Hartman married John Smith, her high school sweetheart. Her family described Janice as a free spirit and John Smith as a young man with a short fuse.
The first time I met John Smith was at our old house on Dut Road, and him and I got into a chess game that ended up, I won, and the chess pieces ended up all over the floor. They actually, the board and everything got slammed right up against the wall. I took away that he had a temper like a match. It was instant, hot.
It wasn't long before the marriage fell apart. 3 days after their divorce was final, Janice Hartman Smith got in her car outside this bar and drove away. It was November 17th, 1974. She was never seen again. But police say her car was found right here at John Smith's trailer. Sergeant Brian Potts later investigated the disappearance.
It just seemed that if she did take off, she would have taken that car with her. She wouldn't have let, especially him, the man she just divorced, have that car.
So what really happened? Did Janice just take off? Or was she dead? And did John Smith kill her? Janice's family believed he did, but there was no hard evidence. 17 years passed. By 1991, John Smith was working as an engineer at this New Jersey plant, and he was married again. Betty Fran Gladden had become the second Mrs. John Smith. And little more than a year after they were married, she became the second Mrs. John Smith to vanish without a trace. Her daughter, Dina Weiss.
I called up and I said, where's Mom? And he said, well, I thought she was with you. And he said, well, you know, I came home to a note on Tuesday that said that, you know, I'm going to be gone, feed the fish.
Dina was in Texas, and Fran's sister, Sherry Davis, was in Indiana. They were frantic with worry, and they say, even a week after Fran disappeared, they were still pushing John Smith to report it to police.
But it wasn't until we said, we're coming, we're going to go do it ourselves, that he stopped on the way home from work and actually made the missing persons report.
The missing persons case was assigned to Detective Mike Dansbury of the West Windsor, New Jersey Police.
I made mention to Mike, I said, this is a 40-year-old bachelor. And Mike said, no, John's been married. And I said, Mike, where is his wife? He said, I don't know. It was a very young marriage. Didn't work out. They separated.
Dina and Sherry tried to find John's first wife, Janice. And when they couldn't, they found her brother, Gary Hartman, back in Ohio.
Oh, man, that phone call. I'll never forget that feeling.
And he said, what is this about? And I said, Mr. Hartman, I said, my sister was married to John David Smith.
And she's missing, isn't she?
And he said, my God, lady, you have a problem. My sister disappeared 17 years ago, never to be heard from again.
John Smith moved again, this time across the country, where no one seemed to know about the mysteries of his past. Smith was working at a custom car shop in San Diego and renting an apartment in the home of Trevor and Sue Haywood.
We liked him. He was probably one of the nicest guys I've ever met.
If John was sketchy about his past, Sue wrote it off to a broken heart. He had a picture of Fran, his wife, in a frame, and according to Sue, he had quite a sad story to go with it.
He told me that he never wanted to talk about it because he loved her very much and that she had cancer and that he nurtured her to her deathbed, unfortunately, and that it hurt him very much.
John Smith apparently recovered pretty quickly. Before long, he met this woman, Diane Bertalin.
We were all really happy that they got together and started dating, and then we were completely shocked when they told us they were getting married like 6 weeks later.
That's right. Diane became the third Mrs. John Smith in September of 1998. Trevor was the best man. Then one morning in May of 1999, the FBI showed up on the Haywoods' doorstep.
I was pretty shocked when he told me that the reason why they were here is because there was a possibility that John had murdered his 2 ex-wives.
The FBI also grilled John Smith for hours that day, but they say he said he had no idea what happened to his missing wives. And later, when I tried to ask about them, he said even less. Mr. Smith, I have to ask you about the disappearances of your 2 wives. Don't you think it's strange that they both disappeared mysteriously? Pressure was mounting on John Smith. His third wife, Diane, filed for divorce and a restraining order, saying she was afraid of him. The FBI says they had a big break. This house in Seville, Ohio, had been the home of John Smith's grandparents, and the FBI found a source who they say actually saw the body of Smith's first wife, Janice, in a box that was hidden in this garage.
It would have been June of 1979 that the source, granddad and this neighbor, observed the remains of John's wife, Janice.
And they all kept quiet about it?
Yes.
And what was the last thing anybody saw of John Smith in this box?
At that point, the box was last seen in the passenger seat of John's 1979 Corvette as he drove off with it.
But where was the missing box? The FBI spent days playing hunches, even digging up another garage John Smith might have had access to, but no box and no body. Then Sherry came up with a plan to expand the search.
I knew that letters had gone out within Ohio to coroners and sheriff's departments. I said, I think we need to spread out. Let's go Indiana. By that time, we had knowledge that John had indeed lived in Indiana.
So Sherry spent an evening pulling up the address for every coroner and sheriff in Indiana. Then this letter went out asking for any information on a Jane Doe, maybe in a plywood box, found within the last 20 years. One of the letters happened to land on the desk of, you remember, Jerry Berman, the Indiana deputy sheriff, who for 20 years had been haunted by the case of the lady in the box. What were the chances that the letter would find its way to the only cop who'd been around long enough to remember the case?
It's fortunate for Wayne County, Ohio, that I still hadn't retired and went home and went fishing.
Item 4, John Smith.
On October 3rd, 2000, John Smith was arrested for the murder of Janice Hartman Smith. He pled not guilty. Smith went to trial, and prominently displayed was the wooden box prosecutors say John Smith built just days after Janice disappeared.
He built the box to keep her, and he kept her for 5 years in his grandfather's garage.
The stunner of the trial came when a witness, who asked not to be videotaped, revealed that he was the source who tipped off the FBI about the secret in the box.
You know, I was hoping to bury this, but this thing just don't bury. It don't go away. You don't have the nightmares. I do.
You see, that source turned out to be none other than John Smith's brother, Michael, who'd gotten curious about a box tucked away in their grandfather's garage.
What part of the box did you find open?
What I would have pried the top of. What I found was what appeared to be legs. Human legs that had been cut off just below the kneecaps. eventually I came across a face, and it was Janice Hartman.
So you didn't call the police?
No, I called my brother. The reason I didn't call the police, I was scared to death. I thought I was part of a murder that I had nothing to do with. You know, I was there, I seen the box, I found the box, I opened the box, I called my brother, he came and got it.
John Smith's attorney admitted Smith had possessed Janice Hartman's remains, but denied his client had killed her.
Is there one witness who came in here and said Janice was afraid of John? At this period of time, they got along fine.
The jury deliberated for 7.5 hours.
As to the charge of the murder, the verdict is guilty.
John Smith was handed a sentence of 15 years to life. For Gary Hartman, there was finally some relief.
Now, everyone knows John Smith was a murderer.
And what about Smith's second missing wife, Betty Fran? Her sister Sherry was allowed to address Smith at his sentencing.
I would ask you just to look at me in the eye for 1 minute, because I have only one other thing to say to you. I can live with my last memory of my sister. Can you?
For Sherry and Dina, this story is far from over.
My only question is to John. Where's my mom? What'd you do with her? And then we'll stop. Justice will be served and we'll stop.
John Smith is currently serving 15 years to life in an Ohio prison for the murder of Janice Hartman and is eligible for parole in 2019. As of 2013, the body of his second wife, Betty Fran, still has not been found, and her missing persons case remains open. When we come back, a young woman with the perfect husband.
He was a pilot, he was a gourmet chef, he was an expert skier.
But there was one thing her sister didn't know.
This letter says that you are worried about her husband killing her.
That's right. What happened to the surgeon's wife? Stay with us. When Elaine Katz first heard about her sister Gail's boyfriend, she was happy for her. He was the kind of successful, handsome doctor anyone would welcome into the family. But as John Miller first reported in 2000, the more Elaine learned about Dr. Robert Birnbaum, the more worried she grew. And when her sister vanished mysteriously, Elaine knew it had to be him. But how did he do it? And how could she prove it?
Elaine Katz confronts the man she believes murdered her sister.
Bob, why don't you tell the cameras to the public how innocent you are? Bob, why don't you tell the public that you're innocent? Why don't you tell me that you didn't kill my sister? 15 years I'm waiting to hear you say that you didn't kill my sister.
Dr. Robert Birnbaum emphatically denies killing his wife, but with charges of murder and two families pitted against each other, it's all turned very ugly. But it didn't start out that way. No, in the beginning, it was much more like a fairy tale.
She was very happy, very much in love.
To their friends and family, Gail Katz and Robert Birnbaum seemed like the perfect couple.
They were close in age, they were both Jewish. She was interested in becoming a clinical psychologist, he was a doctor.
In fact, Dr. Robert Birnbaum seemed almost too good to be true.
He was a pilot, he was a gourmet chef and a classical guitarist, and he was an expert skier. She was so starry-eyed when she told me he took her up in a plane and flew over all of the bridges at night in Manhattan. And it was just as romantic and beautiful as could be.
Gail's sister Elaine and her brother Stephen told me even before Gail married Robert Birnbaum, she hinted he had a dark side.
And she would say, Bob is best on paper. And she was telling me that if you listed Bob's accomplishments, he sounded just perfect. But there was something wrong. He had high standards for everything. She was very thin, but never thin enough. She had to be, extremely careful. He would complain if her hair wasn't just perfect.
In 1982, Gail Katz and Dr. Robert Birnbaum were engaged. Elaine says Gail had simply learned to live with her fiancé's extreme need for control.
She would go to turn on a light switch, and he would put on the light switch. He couldn't even let her turn on a light.
Ultimately, Elaine supported her sister's engagement, despite what she viewed as Birnbaum's insecurities and quirks, until late one night in 1982, when she says she received a hysterical call from Gail.
She explained to me that Bob had tried to strangle the kitten in the toilet bowl. And he had the cat's head under the water, and he had his fingers around the throat of the cat. This was about a month before the wedding, and I looked at her and I said, "So we're calling the wedding off?" And she said no, that she loved him, and the cat was safe now, and she wouldn't get another animal, and he had done it because he was insecure about her love.
Elaine told me that Gail swore her to secrecy about the cat incident, and later that year, Gail and Robert were married.
And she convinced herself that she could be the perfect wife that would make him content, happy, change him.
And they were happy, or at least appeared to be, until one day in November of 1983. In November of 1983, she files this police report. It reads, "The defendant strangled her to the point at which she lost consciousness."
Gail wasn't permitted to smoke. And apparently Bob had unexpectedly returned home. And she told me that he was so alarmed by the sight of her smoking that he had literally leapt over the couch and, strangled her, pushing her off her chair onto the floor. She'd lost consciousness.
So Gail convinced her husband to see a therapist, Dr. Michael Stone. And at the end of seeing him, did you have the impression that he was under control?
No. I had the impression that he was not in good control, nor likely to become so.
Dr. Stone said Birnbaum decided not to go forward with the sessions, but concerned for Gail's safety, Dr. Stone did something he says he's never done in 35 years of practice. He wrote a declaration for Gail to sign, stating that she was in danger and that he had warned her.
The letter says, it's dated the 21st of November, 83, I have been advised by Dr. Stone that for reasons of my own safety, I should, at this time, live apart from my husband, Dr. Robert Birnbaum.
It was a letter Gail's sister had not seen until I handed her a copy.
If I do not heed this advice, I must accept the consequences, including the possibility of personal injury or death at the hands of my husband, and absolve Dr. Stone of responsibility for any such eventuality.
This letter says that you are worried about her husband killing her.
Yes.
And that you're trying to warn her.
That's right.
When we come back, Dr. Stone's worst fears come true. Gail Katz disappears, and investigators come up with a bizarre theory.
All you gotta do is just yaw the airplane the right way so the air doesn't hit the door, and all you need is just a nudge.
Stay with us. Gail Katz had married Dr. Robert Birnbaum with the highest hopes. But over the 3 years of their marriage, she grew increasingly frightened of his violent temper. Her therapist warned her that she was risking her life living with him, but she couldn't stay away. And that decision may have cost Gail her life. Once again, John Miller.
She was in love. I know to you and I that probably sounds silly, but she still had her romantic vision.
And her family believes that romantic vision blinded Gail to the real dangers they believe came to fruition that summer. Police reports say Dr. Robert Birnbaum told them that on July 7th, 1985, he and Gail had an argument, and that she walked out, saying she was going to Central Park to cool off. She was never seen again. When Gail disappeared, her brother Stephen came to help in the search, but he says Bob seemed to be avoiding Gail's family.
He wasn't spending time with us, grieving with us, worrying with us. You know, where is his wife? Where is my sister? Where is my parents' daughter?
I knew at that point that Bob had said she left the apartment at 11 o'clock and, went to cool off after an argument. Meanwhile, the doorman had claimed not to have seen her. And at that point, I felt that Bob was responsible and that he had done something terrible.
According to New York City police, Dr. Birnbaum told them on the afternoon his wife vanished, he stayed in their apartment till about 5:30, then drove to New Jersey to attend a family party, stopped to visit a friend who was going to medical school, and then he says he returned home to their apartment late that night.
Hi, Jones, O'Malley here, 10 Squad.
But Missing Persons Squad Detective Thomas O'Malley had his doubts. He knew that Birnbaum was a surgeon with access to surgeon's tools. O'Malley wanted to search the apartment and check the bathroom drain traps for traces of blood and tissue. But without enough evidence to get a warrant, O'Malley could only search where Birnbaum's lawyer allowed him to.
They used this weird system where they would tell him as he was walking hot or cold, and it was the hot or the cold that meant that he couldn't continue to search where he was searching.
With the case at a dead end, in 1986, it landed on the desk of Andy Rosenzweig, chief investigator at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. When Rosenzweig went through the file, he noted that Dr. Birnbaum was a pilot. He wondered, if Birnbaum was a licensed pilot, did he fly on the day his wife vanished? Rosenzweig sent an investigator out to canvass small New Jersey airports, looking for the logbooks for July 7th, 1985, the day that Gail disappeared. Here at Essex County Airport, the investigator flipped open the logbooks and found this, an entry that says Bob Birnbaum signed out a Cessna 172 and flew for 2 hours on the day his wife vanished. And detectives say, in all the times they questioned him about his activities that day, he never mentioned the flight. Investigators believe Birnbaum killed Gail in their apartment in this building, that he wrapped up her body or body parts and carried it out one of 3 exits, loaded it into a car, and at some point took her to the airport. They believe he flew an hour out over the ocean. They believe that the surgeon dumped the body or body parts into the sea. One of Dr. Birnbaum's supporters argued to me that it would have been very difficult for one person to fly a plane like this one with no autopilot and still manage to reach across the cockpit, open a door, hold it against the wind, and shove out a 120-pound body. Marcus Jado is a flight instructor at Caldwell Flight School. Using a duffel bag with more than 100 pounds of sand, he showed me just how easy it could be to dispose of a body if you were an experienced pilot.
It wasn't difficult at all. All you gotta do is just yaw the airplane the right way so the air doesn't hit the door, and all you need is just a nudge.
Still, in 1986, without a body or a witness, prosecutors were reluctant to bring a charge of murder against Birnbaum. If the suspicions of Gail's family and investigators were true, had Robert Birnbaum committed the perfect murder? In the years since Gail's disappearance, Birnbaum had found a new life in Minot, North Dakota, where he was a doctor, admired by many.
A very intelligent, very gifted individual.
Lee Trotter, a surgeon at Trinity Health in Minot, was Birnbaum's closest colleague.
He would travel around donating his time, his monies to help other people that did not have access to plastic surgery that they needed.
But the case continued to haunt the DA's chief investigator, Andy Rosenzweig. 12 years had passed. Before he retired to Newport, Rhode Island, he reopened the Birnbaum case to see if new leads could be found.
You're looking for gaps, things that weren't done.
The DA's investigators interviewed Birnbaum's old friends and new friends. Prosecutors say they uncovered inconsistent statements Birnbaum allegedly made about his wife's disappearance. Finally, in 1999, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office presented the evidence to a grand jury. Robert Birnbaum was indicted on charges of murder. With his new wife at his side, he returned to New York and surrendered. Dr. Birnbaum, we've been trying to talk to you for a while, or arranged to talk to you, and in the name of fairness, we have to ask you, did you kill your wife? I made several attempts to get Dr. Birnbaum to tell his side of the story, but he remained silent.
And doctor, you have nothing to say about this? You know, they've charged that you took her in an airplane.
He has no comment.
And threw her out?
He's in the middle of a prosecution. We'll say what we have to say in court. And after the trial, then you'll see that my client will be found not guilty. Thank you.
In court papers, Birnbaum's lawyer, Scott Greenfield, has argued while Gail did vanish, there is no evidence that she's dead. And if she is, he argued that Gail had extramarital affairs, that she could have been killed by a boyfriend, that 4 years earlier she had attempted suicide, so she could have killed herself. Judge Leslie Crocker Snyder denied the motion to dismiss the charges for lack of evidence, but even so, Dr. Birnbaum's friends don't believe he could have done it.
The Bob Birnbaum I know is not capable of doing such a thing. He told me point blank, he said, "Lee, I did not do this thing."